I just want to thank you all for tuning in today. Happy to be here from Phoenix, Arizona, where it is absolutely beautiful outside. And I know that that's not the case everywhere around the country. So, again, we appreciate you taking a few minutes to join us today as we talk about this topic of healthy helping and enabling. And this is obviously a near and dear topic to my heart, not only because I work here at PAL, but because obviously it impacted my family. When you have an organization called Parents of Addicted Loved Ones, it's fairly obvious what the topic is. And to be perfectly honest, I wasn't sure at many points in our life that Sean would be sitting here with me today. So I am very proud of him. I am very proud of what he does. And I look forward to sharing the time with him as we talk about this particular topic. And of course, he comes at it from a very different perspective than his mom and I do. But again, before we just jump into that topic, I want to just to tell you just a little bit about PAL and set up a couple of things about what, as far as what's going on around the country. I know many of you know this, but I just want to give you just a little bit of background information on parents of addicted loved ones. So if we can go to that next slide. And so again, I'm not going to go over these details. Most of you know that the addiction issue is a big problem. This information was what was happening right before the COVID issue hit. And we were already in the area of 70,000, losing 70,000 people a year just to overdoses. And of course, many more to issues such as alcohol. But then, of course, we're seeing all these other drugs that were coming in and making a big impact, like fentanyl and other variations of other drugs that are now coming out, like ISO and some other ones that are very dangerous around the country. But if we go to the next slide, the pandemic has, of course, created this underlying pandemic. And all of the figures are not out yet for last year. But we're already seeing a massive increase, that the numbers that we saw in the past are going to be significantly higher than they ever were. In Maricopa County, where we live, here they are reporting a 160% increase in overdoses over the past year. So we can't even imagine how deep this problem has actually become over this last year, based on the fact of everything from the economic issue to just the isolation issues to all the other problems that are associated with COVID. So the other piece of this is to just realize that if you want to be on a cover of a magazine, one thing you don't want to be there for is probably having to do with this issue. And this was on the cover of Money Magazine a couple of years ago, and essentially their focus was on the enormous cost to families over this issue of drug addiction, and yet they ended up turning the story into a very important piece for us, in the sense that they really told the story of PAL. There were 4 families in there. 3 of those were PAL families. And I bring this up because it really helped us get the word out that there are resources and there is help out there for families. So with that, a couple of things were already mentioned. That we were started about going on 6 years ago, and we provide these free weekly meetings. We use an evidence-based curriculum. Our whole concept is peer-to-peer support. And the idea is clearly to give parents hope so that they have the tools they need. And that's exactly what we're going to be talking about here in just a minute, is probably one of the most important tools that my wife and I learned through all of this. And then the key is realizing that when the family gets involved, I do believe that one of the most important things is that this gives your loved one a greater opportunity for success in recovery. So with that, we'll go to the next slide here. essentially, I put this up because there's lots of relationships. There's obviously, you have spouse relationships where you have addiction, and there's many others. But the one between a parent and their children, or even a grandparent and children, is really unique. And it's different in the sense that, we have built in us ideas about how we're supposed to parent. And this gets really turned upside down, almost to the point of being the exact opposite. So again, the topic we're going to talk about today is really based out of that issue, that it's extremely difficult to change the way that you are programmed, I believe, as a parent to respond when something goes wrong with your child. So again, that's what PAL is all about. It's parents helping parents, and as the slide, we'll go ahead and continue on here. We're going to get into this concept of healthy helping versus enabling. But the key is change, and that's what was so difficult for me. I think I had to get to the point where I realized that my way wasn't working, that as the fix-it person, as the person that wanted to just solve all the problems in our family, I couldn't do it. And the second point up there that says treating them like an adult, I thought I was, and now in retrospect, I was not. And probably one of the most difficult things I had to learn was that when they turned 18, the government promoted them to adulthood. Unfortunately, I kept showing up to work thinking that I was the parent and this is a child and I'm going to fix whatever it is in their life that isn't right, in spite of the fact that I had been fired by the government for doing that. And so it is difficult, but the reality is there's hope, and there are ways to work through this. And PAL's mission is really to provide hope through education and support, and our vision is to make these meetings available for wherever they're needed. So if there's no PAL meeting near you and you're interested, we would love to hear from you after this. If you email us at info@palgroup.org, we can tell you about how to get a meeting started in your area. Everything is free, and we simply want to bring this hope to people around the country. And I just want to take 1 second and thank Archway for their interest in doing this, and also the work that they do and our partnership in all of this. I certainly appreciate it. So with that, we're going to jump into today's topic, and that is enabling versus healthy helping. And the first thing I always want to talk about is this whole topic of, this word enabling. Pretty much a word that you don't use in everyday language. As a matter of fact, you probably don't use it unless you've been around somebody that has an addiction issue. And so I remember hearing that. I knew what it meant, but the reality is that when we found out that Sean, our older son, was involved in using drugs, my immediate reaction was, of course, we got to do something about this, and his mom and I just started everything we could, because at the time when we found this out, he was 15 years old. He had gotten involved with some pills that were opioids, and now it was progressing and it was starting to affect his life and his ability to do things. And so he was under 18, so we did what everybody, I would think, would try and do, and that is we tried to just get him the help he needed. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, the more we pushed, the more we tried, it just didn't seem to be doing what we wanted. As a matter of fact, I think it not only got worse, but what I found interesting was that in retrospect, as I look back now, we were being fooled better and better. I mean, at first it was like, it was obvious. And then later it became, well, I don't know if he's doing anything. Well, I don't think he's doing anything. And then I'd find out later, he was still doing things. Mm-hmm. So maybe I'll just turn it over to you for a second, Sean, and just to let you just talk about kind of how this all started, and then just maybe just basics about this whole concept of how you started to just get away with what you wanted and why you started doing that even at an early age of 15.
Okay, sure. Yeah. So thanks for being here today, everybody. But I think inherently, some people, I don't know how much there is behind this, but I feel like I kind of was just born this way. Maybe from the genetic standpoint, there was nothing I feel like that happened to me per se as far as like a specific traumatic event that I could identify that made me, use drugs. I think it was kind of just a position I was in where, I had some anxieties, I had some misgivings about myself, or didn't feel very confident, and just through kind of like some gradual exposure to, marijuana, alcohol, things like that, found that, taking substances can alleviate some of those symptoms. And for whatever reason, I just gravitated towards that. So when it came to, drugs and alcohol, as I said, some exposure at that younger age to the alcohol, the marijuana. But it wasn't until I had an opportunity to try opiates that I really felt what I would call like a spiritual experience happened for me with that substance, or ingesting that substance, and the effects produced by that. Really all of my shortcomings, or things that I thought about myself, the uneasiness, the anxiety, depression, whatever the symptoms, you want to identify those, but that took that away. That made me feel like I could breathe when I used those things. So to answer your question, as far as enabling, or how I was able to be in a position to do these things, or to continue to do these things despite having this supervision of my parents, or whatever the case may be. When it comes to drug addiction, there's really no bounds to the lengths that you'll go to make sure that you stay intoxicated. I found myself in a lot of places that I don't think fondly of, or places that I didn't think I would be. But the bottom line is that when you are when you're struggling with that disease of addiction, there's going to be situations where you no longer have that choice of what you're going to do to maintain your habit. Does that make sense? As far as, so when it comes to something like, I don't want to hurt my parents. I don't necessarily want to manipulate people or disappoint people. But those things pale in comparison to like the physiological and psychological need to do those substances. So you wind up in positions where you're doing those things.
Well, and to put this into context, my wife and I essentially between 15 and 18, got him in to see a counselor, took him to the doctor, tried to force him to, go to these things to get the help that he needed. And we'd get these little reprieves where it seemed like he was doing okay. Later, of course, we learned that actually he was figuring out how to keep us happy, so that we would allow him to continue to do what he was doing. So he had started to figure out right away that if he could just keep us at bay and keep us somewhat happy, then he could continue to do what he was doing. Mm-hmm. And to give you a little idea of how this progressed, obviously, it got worse, and it went from, taking some pills and finding these in obviously ways, inappropriate ways like stealing and things like that, to eventually this led to smoking heroin, which eventually led to IV heroin use, and of course many other drugs as well, which happens a lot with people that get involved with these kinds of drugs. Mm-hmm. And that went on for years. So as we talk about this, and we get into this topic, I want to keep it in the context of, if you think that when I'm sharing all these things that I figured it out, that my wife and I figured it out immediately, that we just did these things and we got it all right, the answer is that didn't happen. And as a matter of fact, we had to learn over and over and over again that what we were doing was not helping. And our instinct was jump in, save, fix, do what we had to do. And at the time when we were first dealing with Sean, he has a younger brother, and we had the, I'll call it the luxury of him not being involved in this, and him seeing all of this and saying, of course, he would never do anything like this. Mm-hmm. And so we were sort of holding on to Andrew, our younger son, and saying, well, we've got him doing well, and we're going to keep trying to help Sean. But in the aspect of the big picture, that's what was happening. And then, of course, one day Andrew drops out of college. We try to figure out what's going on, and then eventually we realize that he has fallen into this as well. And now my wife and I are looking at the fact that we have two sons, both using drugs like this. There's no, as you said, traumatic event that necessarily occurred that caused all of this. And yet I will tell you that we felt like we were the worst parents on the planet, that we were complete failures, and that we obviously didn't know what to do or how to solve this, and the shame and the guilt were piling up. Now, the reason I think it's important to understand that is because that becomes something that can be used against you. Mm-hmm. Because when you're feeling guilty and you're feeling like, I caused this, then that's something that somebody could take advantage of. So maybe you could just talk just a little bit about how, like, especially at the very beginning, how maybe you saw us as I hate to say this, but as an opportunity to get what you needed.
Sure, yeah. I think that it kind of goes without saying, but as you said, anybody that's in a really emotionally vulnerable state, I think is kind of just open to that position where it's going to be easy to really pull on your heartstrings and to have you in a position to where you're more likely to concede certain things just because of the way you feel about the situation. So I will say that a lot of people, I don't know if they necessarily go into these situations with the explicit desire or to be just like a really bad person or a manipulative person. But I think that once that disease has taken hold of your brain, even inadvertently, you're going to be acting out in behaviors that are manipulative of people. Because again, as I mentioned before, that need for the substance, that need to continue to stay intoxicated, that's going to surpass everything on a psychological level with you. So yeah, there was times where my parents, I think they were trying their best, or the best they knew at the time. And I think that they were hurting greatly in this situation because it was so confusing. It was so unprecedented for them. And I think I absolutely took advantage of that in the way that, my mom felt bad. My dad felt bad about the situation. And I, could use that in a way to gain resources from them, or continue to, just because of maybe the guilt they had or the shame they had. And again, like I said, I don't consider myself like an evil person or anything like that, but I think that I was just completely lost in that disease, in that moment, and I didn't really see it as a choice anymore. It was really more just, I'm going to do exactly what I need to get what I need in that moment, and if that means going to my mom and being like, oh, I'm hurting so bad, or I'm in this position, I really need your help, and I really need, this, or this, knowing that me presenting the way that I was in that moment was probably going to get me what I needed. And it did. There was times where that worked before, the exposure to PAL and these principles of this program.
So essentially, to kind of recap before we get into how we started to make some changes, this continued on for about 9 years. And of course, it devolved into arrests, to many hospitalizations, eventually overdoses we know nothing about, to very serious illnesses, and clearly behaviors that were things that were scaring us that we would lose them, and or they could end up in prison for the rest of their lives type of situations. And as that progressed, and we essentially continued to get worse in our physical and emotional state, we simply, were getting desperate, desperate for, what could we do? What would help? What would do something different? Because we tried everything, but what we were trying was what was in our toolbox. And what was in our toolbox was normal parenting skills.
Sure.
Well, and the sad thing is that normal parenting skills don't work. And as a matter of fact, and I say this and I'm being facetious, but I'm not. And that is you almost have to think to yourself, if I'm going to do this, if my brain says do this, do the opposite, and it'll probably be closer to what's going to help. And I just couldn't wrap my head around it, because I was like, I have to do these things. And if I look back and say, is there anything that I would look at and say, well, wow, I wish we would have done that differently? The answer is yes. It's easy to look back and say, I wish I would have done things differently. And one of those things is what I would call enabling. And I would say that started early, like as in very young childhood, and realizing that it's actually okay when you're enabling a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old, when you're doing things for them that they need somebody to do for them. Because if you think about enabling is really doing something for someone that they could and should be doing for themselves. But the hard part is when they're young, you want to do things for them, you want to help them, and so you develop this idea that that's how it works in a relationship with a child, is that you're the parent, therefore your job is to do everything for them. And we don't let people suffer consequences, and we don't let people learn from their experience. And I believe that what happens when the drugs start is that we fall into that behavior. And so if you're doing anything, like, I remember when I thought it was a big deal that he was losing his credit, is that he had run up, money, and he had no money, and he hadn't paid his bills and all this. And I was so upset that, we were going to pay off all this debt, $2,000 worth of debt and all this other stuff. And that was a big deal to me. It's like, he can't wreck his credit. I mean, that would be horrible, if he wrecked his credit. Of course, later, after doing those kinds of things over and over, I realized that, that's not my concern. And not only should it not be my concern, but more importantly, my focus should have been on, I hope he survives all of this. I'm sitting here worried about, oh my gosh, his credit score could be bad. And in the process, all these other things are happening. So, we made all their appointments for them. We took them everywhere. We did everything for them. And of course, again, when they're 5, they're 10, they're 12, they're 13, you do that. But we kept doing that. And we kept, paying debts, and we kept working on trying to get you to go to a treatment program, and then drive you to the treatment program, and then try and make sure you stayed in the treatment program, and then did all of these things. And so as you think about it and you go back, maybe you could just talk a little bit about how, and I hate to say this again, but I'm going to use this word, is take advantage of what you knew your mom and I wanted.
Sure.
So that you could then make it, for lack of a better term, seem like you were going to do that.
Yeah.
So that you could kind of continue.
Sure. Yeah. I think that, when it comes to what you're talking about as far as, I think you could kind of notice the pattern, like historically, with the relationship and our behavior, and how that was playing out at the time. And I think absolutely, you know, like I capitalized on that, and the fact that I knew that there were ways that I could, I guess, act, or things that I could do that I thought would appease you or please you, or assuage some of those feelings, while still not really fully committing to recovery, or not really fully committing to changing my life. I think, to be completely honest with you, I know that people, especially, there's this kind of like quirky like personality trait with people who, and this is anecdotal, but in my experience, you know, people who struggle with addiction, we don't really learn from the mistakes of others. You know, they always, this is kind of like a saying, is that, you know, wise people, they'll look at these experiences and they'll look at these lessons, and they'll learn from the mistakes of others. But in my experience, most addicts and alcoholics, you really have to fall flat on your face and experience that yourself to be in a position to where you want to change your life. So basically, this cycle that we were in, where, you know, my parents, they really want me to do treatment, or they really are trying to help me with this or with that, or whatever the case may be. It really was just allowing me to continue to kind of take advantage of that situation, because I wasn't falling on my face. As I said, I wasn't experiencing as significant consequences as I could have, as if I didn't have that resource, if that makes sense. So in that relationship, you know, that was the dynamic for a long time. I think that when there's still those pieces of you guys really trying to kind of drive the bus, if you will, it was just bound to fail, because that really, in the end, was just giving me ammunition to kind of continue acting the way that I was, continue being a manipulative person in my disease, and getting what I wanted from that situation.
And as I reflect back, and I'm going to talk now about how these things started to change, you know, at first, I know this seems ridiculous. It seems to me, and I mean this, it seems ridiculous to me now, is that, you know, handing somebody who's active in their addiction cash seems like one of the dumbest things you would ever do. Mm-hmm. And now, I mean, I'm like, if anybody says that, I would just immediately say, don't give somebody that's active in addiction cash. I mean, you know what they're going to do with it. I mean, they're going to turn it into drugs. So we would try and change in our thinking that we could do this and help in ways that were different. So, for example, you know, Sean was active in his addiction, but he had a car, which, by the way, we had paid for. But he then, you know, would say, well, I need gas money. You know, and how do I get a job if I don't have gas in my car? So I'm thinking, well, you know, I'm not going to give him cash. So I would say, I'll drive and I'll meet him. So I was meeting him all over town at gas stations, and then paying for the gas to go in the car. Of course, to find out later that at some points, even gas was being siphoned out of cars and sold, you know, by either him or his brother, or this allowed them to then use their resources that they had to do what they wanted to do. Correct. Instead of having to pay for gas to put it in the car. So inadvertently, even if I was trying to do it in a way that I thought was a way that would keep him from using it for resources for drugs, it wasn't working. Mm-hmm. And so when my wife found POW, and we went to our first meeting, it was interesting because it was literally at the time when Sean first went into a treatment program, and it had been almost 9 years, I think, at this point.
12.
And eventually, when he finally, it was at that point. And so he had gotten into this, and he was in this program that was supposed to last 30 days, and we went to a PAL meeting. And we were sitting in there, and I heard some people in the room talking about their experience, and one of them made a comment about how, you know, it's probably not a good idea for them to live with you. And I'm thinking, well, that's that's ridiculous. I mean, I know he's in his 20s now, and he's, in this 30 days, and in 30 days he's going to be fine. So I'm going to remodel his room, and I'm not joking. I'm remodeling his room, and I'm going to make it this really nice place for him to come back to, so that, he can take off from here and just launch into his life after his 30 days of sobriety. And so I'm sitting there doing all this stuff, and these crazy people in this meeting are saying that's probably not a good idea. Mm-hmm. And they say, that's really not letting him learn on his own 2 feet and, mm-hmm. and to start to experience life and to be an adult. And I'm thinking, well, what do you mean? And they go, that's not healthy. And that's where this concept of healthy helping started to come up. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, but I don't understand. That doesn't make any sense to me. And after a few weeks of being around people kind of surrounding us and saying, maybe we shouldn't do this, I remember I called Sean up there at this facility, and I said, look, I don't think it's a good idea that you come home. And at first, of course, he tried, that this is, what he wanted to do. And, of course, he wanted to come back home. And, of course, what I didn't realize is that he really probably wasn't very serious up there, and this was probably not going to last very long, which of course unfortunately it didn't. Mm-hmm. But what I didn't realize was that my ideas of helping were really not helping, and they weren't healthy. Mm-hmm. And so my wife and I started to realize maybe we needed to set some boundaries, and maybe those boundaries meant cutting some strings, and strings are usually financial. And it could be anything from, obviously cash, to getting all the way down to storing people's stuff at your house. Mm-hmm. That's a financial string. Because mm-hmm. if they didn't have it at my house, then they would have to pay for a storage unit. And so even up to and including taking their mail. And I just assume, well, that'd be mean. They don't have a place to have mail, because at one point here, Sean's living literal on the streets in bushes. I'm getting calls from the police that they're finding him there. So of course he needs a place to get his mail. And it's like, I have ingrained in my head that all of this is my responsibility. And what I don't realize is that all of those things are enabling. Mm. And I know it. I don't know where you're at with this. You may have to get to where you see it that way. You may just see it as don't give them money. But I'm going to suggest to you that doing anything for someone that they should be doing for themselves, especially when they're at this age, is not helping them. Mm-hmm. It's not healthy. Mm-hmm. They're not getting any self-esteem from learning from their mistakes and growing. Mm-hmm. And I think if I go back now and I realize that is what we finally had to start wrapping our head around. And I'd love to tell you that I just, we sat down, we set some boundaries, and immediately, we made all these changes. Well, we didn't. The first one was the most difficult, which was we were going to not pay for a cell phone. Yeah. I fretted over not paying for the cell phone for a month. I wrote out a thing about what I was going to say to him. I went to all this extent to, all we're going to do is take him off the cell phone. And we went over to Cricket. We bought a cell phone. They let you put it in somebody else's name, paid for 30 days in advance, and then I still couldn't bring myself to give it to him. And finally I met him. He was actually at this point staying in a sober living place. And I remember meeting him. And I thought for sure this was going to send him over the edge. I handed him the cell phone and I said, listen, your mom and I want to apologize for this, for not allowing you to grow up and to take care of your own things and to do your own things, and not letting you get the self-esteem you'd get from solving problems. And you know what? We're going to take you off our cell phone plan because it's time you had your own. And by the way, we are going to not just leave you hanging, so here's a cell phone, but in 30 days, they're going to text you, and they're going to turn it off if you don't pay for it. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, he's going to drop over, right at this point. And he looks at me and he goes, okay. Have you ever not had a cell phone?
No, yeah.
And so as I think about it, maybe you could talk about the fact that once your mom and I started to make these changes, how did that affect you? Sure. I mean, I know you weren't happy at first.
Yeah.
But.
Yeah. So, there's a point to be made on kind of like looking at this like a safety net, with like what he's talking about. When you have all these ways you're supporting someone financially, with the resources if they're living with you. You've still got the addict or the individual. They still have this gigantic safety net to where they know that, like, in the behavior I'm doing now, regardless of the choices or the actions that I take, I'm still going to have this big safety net down here so that if I mess all this up and I fall down, mom or dad or whoever is going to be there to bail me out of this situation. And when you have, like, ingrained that, when you've acted in that way for so long and you've had that pattern of behavior from the parent and the relationship between the parents and the child, that's ingrained in our head too. Knowing that this big safety net's here that's going to catch me if I fall and all this. So when my parents, got involved with Powell, when they got involved with Mike and started slowly, implementing some of these principles in their lives and inadvertently in mine, as a result of that, I was angry. I think I probably really tried to guilt trip them and really tried to tell them that what they were doing was hurting me, was not helping me. I think specifically there was multiple times where I talked to my mom on the phone and she'd be like, "We're just trying to help you in a different way, in a healthy way," and I'm gonna be like, "Well, it's not working." I said that. I said that so many times, and it's funny because I said that in the moment. It was hard. In the moment, I thought it totally sucked, and I wasn't happy about it. But at the end of the day, slowly, I think I more and more was able to experience some of the consequences that I needed to experience in an effort to affect change. So if someone is comfortable, if someone is enabled basically to stay where they're at their point in their life, they don't have a reason to change. I didn't have a reason for a long time because I knew that regardless of my situation, I was going to have this safety net that we talk about. So when that starts to kind of slowly be chipped away through some of these behaviors and these principles and these practices, that's where, I started to feel the sting of, okay, like I'm getting kicked. I relapsed again. And now, the sober living environment I'm in is kicking me out. Normally in the past, I'm like, oh, mom, I need to come sleep on the couch, whatever. That's not an option anymore. And now, as he said, I'm sleeping in a bush at a park. And I don't know if any of you have slept in a bush at a park, but it's terrible. It sucks. It's not a fun experience. So that's just like a basic example of, the ways that things started to change for me, is that when they started implementing these, as hard as it was for them, I started to feel the sting of consequence and of being like, you know what, that was the spark of an idea that was like, maybe this is an unmanageable situation. Because when you find yourself sleeping in a park and when you find yourself injecting drugs with dirty needles and in places you don't know and things like that, you really start to you're almost forced to really take a hard look at the situation. Whereas, I don't know if I would have found myself in those places. I don't know if I'd be here today because I may still have been enabled in my pattern of behaviors, by the pattern of behaviors that they had. So does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think one of the things that was really hard and for us, and I think for many people, and if you're out there and if anything is running through your head like, well, my circumstance is different, you don't understand. This is what's happening in our situation. I don't want this to sound flippant, but we refer to that now as people suffering from what we call chronic uniqueness. Mm-hmm. And the reason we say that is that we all feel that way. We all feel that there's something about them that is different, or there's some reason why in their circumstance I shouldn't do, and then fill in the blank of set a boundary. And if you see them as a victim, and a victim by definition is someone that is powerless and without choices. So if you see them as a victim, as somebody that is powerless and without choices, then it's easy to go down the road of, I need to do that for them. So if they have, for example, maybe potentially some mental health issues associated with drug abuse, or they have other problems that are physical problems or anything like that, you know, we want to see them in light of that and as a victim, and that they don't have a choice. And yet, what I've come to learn, and I'm not suggesting that this is for everyone, but what I've come to learn is that if they don't deal with the substance use issue, then all those other issues are pretty much impossible to deal with, because that is going to keep you from solving or dealing with those others. So you can't really help somebody with a mental health issue if they have substance use going on top of it.
Correct.
You got to be able to get rid of the substance abuse to deal with the mental health issue.
Correct.
And so if we can get past this idea that our situation is unique, that you know, they you know, they need to be held accountable and responsible for their own actions. But one thing that is really important, and I want you to talk about this, is that we never wanted them to feel like we abandoned them. We never wanted them to feel like we didn't love them. We didn't, you know, and this was hard. I mean, we didn't want to yell at them or lecture them. We wanted to get to the point where we accepted them for who they were and what they were doing, and treat them like an adult. And when you treat somebody like an adult, you don't scream at them, you don't lecture them, you don't tell them how to live their life, but you accept it.
Correct.
And we try to do that in a loving way. And by saying to them over and over when they would call, and Sean was notorious, you know, call in the middle of the night, call whenever, you know, I need this, I need that. And it was like, Sean, we love you, we care about you, but we're not going to do that.
Yeah.
And we are going to continue to believe that you're going to figure this out. We have faith and confidence in you. We believe that you have what it takes, and you are going to do this, and you don't need us. And so could you talk about how you started to hear that message and kind of how that affected you? And
yeah, I think, and it's funny because it's pretty much verbatim what you just said is what I used to hear, you know, on the phone when I'd call at midnight or 1 a.m. or whatever. But after enough times of having that experience with you and having that response to be like, you know what, Sean, like, we love you, we care about you, don't ever think that we don't, you know, it's not about that. But we're only willing at this point to support, you know, recovery-oriented behaviors. And I think leaving it at that is I never felt disrespected. I never felt like my parents hated me or didn't love me. I was confused, you know, and it definitely, I was upset, and there was times where I didn't get my way, you know, and of course that made me upset, or I didn't get what I wanted in that moment or what I thought I needed. But yeah, I would say that there wasn't any time where you know, you were screaming at me at that point, you know, in our relationship, or there wasn't a moment where I felt like my parents have disowned me or they don't want me or anything like that. It was more through having that experience with you over time, to where it got to a point where I just kind of internalized the fact that, you know what, I can't, there's nothing left for me as far as a resource here. I very obviously can't manipulate my parents. They're very obviously working on themselves. And I think some part of my subconscious just kind of accepted that fact at a certain point. So I think that those calls, and you could correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they became less and less towards the end, to where if I was in dire straits, I wasn't calling, you know, my mom anymore. I wasn't calling my dad. I think, yeah, I just don't, I think that over time and through the experience of having those conversations, or my parents saying those things to me in a loving and supportive way, just really, that's when I think I started to experience that kind of like spark of change, of just like, okay, maybe I can't, this situation obviously isn't going the way that I wanted to. So, you know, maybe there's other avenues here, or there's other things that I need to look at in my life if this is what it's become.
And so as we kind of get down to the last few minutes here, I just wanted to get to where, you know, how did this all play out, and what happened with all of this. And for those of you who have heard our story or read about it a little bit, you know, here's kind of really what happened for those who haven't. And and of course it got worse, and we've at this point experienced very serious criminal issues, very serious health issues. And at one point, of course, both he and his brother are out and actively engaged in their addictive behaviors. And Christmas comes around, and your mom and I were like, we had nothing to do, and we were so feeling sorry for ourselves that we were just going to leave town, get a call from a hospital. You're in the hospital, very, very sick. You want us to come there. We have a big debate about it. We finally decide, okay, we're going to go. We end up going to the hospital. We sit with you for 10, 12 days or whatever. You promise us over and over and over that this is it, you're done because you're so sick. And at the end of this, we're thinking you've turned the corner, and you decide to go to a program over in California, and you get out of the hospital. We help you get to this place in California, and that's all we did was give you a one-way ticket over there, and you never even checked into the place. And eventually ended up just the same thing started over there. Once again, the cycle of this happened again, relapse again, get back into recovery again over there. You end up coming back here, and we go through this for another year. Christmas comes back around, and I'll be darned, we've now reset our vacation. We're getting ready to leave, and the phone rings, and he's back in the hospital. And we're like, and they're saying he's really sick. And I get on the phone with the nurse, and she's telling me this, and I just asked her a very strange question, if they thought you were going to live. And she thought that was odd. I had to press her because she couldn't understand why I would ask such a question. She didn't want to answer it. The doctor had apparently just come in the room, so I asked her to ask him. The doctor finally, after me pressing on this, finally says, well, we're going to do the best we can. And I said, well, do you think he's going to survive? And the doctor said, I think he's going to survive. And I said, then tell our son we love him, but we're not coming to visit him. And we're going to go and on vacation. And I would love to tell you that, we just had a wonderful time, and, we didn't cry all the way there, but, we did. But we stuck with that boundary. We needed to do this in a healthy way, and we felt like at this point, that's what was helping him. And so maybe you could just talk about what went through your head in about a minute or so, and then I'm going to wrap things up.
Sure.
So.
Yeah, so at that moment, I think that probably was, God just gave me the gift of desperation in that moment, because I was finally in this just miserable position, yet again, 2 Christmases in a row. Here I am in the hospital on Christmas, sick, all messed up, and I thought to myself after this whole experience, I'm like, I'm sitting here alone with no resources. I've got liver disease. I've got all these issues, pulmonary issues, all this stuff happening in my life. And I'm just like, this just can't be. The end all be all of my existence is not just going to be summed up in this moment of just like, this is the most miserable position I've ever been in my life. But that was a gift, and my parents were a big part of giving me that gift, because I was able to sit there and sit in that misery and sit in that just total, I'm trying to watch my language with what I say, but total, just completely terrible experience. And that was where I turned a corner. I thought, maybe in this experience, maybe this all just can't be about me. My life can't just all be about me. It's got to be about something else. I'm driving the bus into the ground every single day of my life. Everything that I do, all the choices that I make are not good choices. I need somebody to help me through this. And through that miserable experience of loneliness on Christmas at a hospital, and through the pain physically and emotionally and mentally that I felt there, that placed me in a position to where I was reasonable, to where I was willing to listen to somebody different. I reached out to somebody in recovery. Shortly after that, I was able to get into a treatment program where people were able to give me education, to show me love when I did not love myself at all, and eventually was restored, spiritually and physically and mentally, from that disease of addiction to where I sit today. And I can see that as a turning point, specifically that experience I had Christmas through what you learned in PAL, and implementing a boundary. As simple as that. It took a while, for sure, but that was a major part of me getting better. I can say without a shadow of a doubt. Yeah.
So as I wrap this up in the next about 2 minutes, I just wanted to share a few photos with you just to kind of put this all in perspective and wrap this up. So this is my wife and I and our 2 sons, and obviously, being sarcastic as I can be, do they look like future, heroin and meth users and drug users and homeless individuals? And as they progress through the years, do they look like they're getting worse? Do we all look like this miserable family that's all going to end up with this issue? Is that what this looks like? And I will say to you that, I just wouldn't have believed it if you'd have told me that. And I wouldn't have believed that I had to change my thoughts about parenting and my thoughts about how to help my sons to grow up. But eventually, it's been about 7 years ago that this happened. And your brother was about 6-8 months behind you in seeking recovery and getting his life back together. But now, there's some issues from that to who's sitting here next to me. And very different than what we thought was going to ever happen with our beautiful son that you saw in those photos. But, today we have a whole different experience. And our younger son is in this photo as well. We have you now in a relationship, and that completely changed everything. Mm-hmm. And one of the most important things that ever happened was our thought process that first of all, we never thought you'd live. We never thought that you guys would survive. And if you did, we thought for sure it was going to end up in prison. But one thing your mom and I had always hoped and prayed for was that you would have a healthy, loving relationships, and that maybe someday we would have grandchildren, which we assumed at this point we never would. But today, we do have a beautiful granddaughter, and she's the light of our life. And although she was born with a heart defect, she's had 2 major open heart surgeries. She's had multiple other health issues and surgeries and things like that. But she is an absolute, and has nothing to do with drug addiction, by the way. But she's an absolute doll. And as you progress through these, she and I are best friends. And her dad and her obviously have an amazing relationship, and her mom. And we love them all. We're all, so happy to be together. And as you see her kind of growing up here in the last few years, she's now 5 years old. Mm-hmm. By the way, she's holding her dad's hand there, going to the dad-daughter dance and at church. And she's just an amazing little, beautiful little girl that is full of life and full of happiness. And she reminds us every day of the gift that we have of having her in our lives and having all of them in our lives. And I will say to you that as much as this may sound, really, did this make the difference? I don't believe you'd be looking at this picture from a few weeks ago if we had not done what we said we were going to do with Pal, with changing our behaviors and allowing them to experience life and to make those changes. So I am very proud to be here with my son. Both of my sons are homeowners. They're taxpayers. They paid their dues. They're doing fantastic. They have good jobs, and it's great. And I wish we could have time to literally directly answer your questions, but I want to share with you that throughout this, we tried to weave in the answers to as many of the questions as we saw popping up, as well as the ones we got in advance. So again, thank you all for tuning in. Thank you, Archway, for doing this. Sean and I just want to thank you, and we just truly appreciate you. And you can contact us at info@palgroup.org. If you want to get a meeting started, let us know. We'll get you the information on how that works, and we'd love to hear from you. So thank you so much, and we look forward to maybe doing something again in the future. So thank you.
Yep, thank you.